Hi, welcome back to part two. As I explained, this video got a bit longer than I was expecting, so here's the second part, just to get things completed. Cheers, everyone. Bye. Magical attacks is an old self-explanatory rule. If you have magical attacks, your attacks... No, I'm going to have to come back to you on that one. It's too complicated. Magic resistance makes sense once you know how the spells work. Essentially, you have a casting roll on 2d6. If you make it, you cast it. If you have magic resistance, then any spells targeting you will be that much harder to successfully cast. Pretty much what you'd expect, right? You're definitely going to remember about magic resistance because it's going to be on your best units and you're going to be really upset they're dying and you're going to remember, oh, I've got a way to save them. Woohoo! Mercenaries is a rule that I think is going to come into play as the game evolves. It doesn't seem to affect anything as far as I can tell from the army books at the moment. There's no models I can spot that have this rule. But the way it is described in the rule book, reading between the lines, makes me think that there might be Empire and Ogre units that commonly have this rule later on. And it might affect how you can recruit them and how they behave when they're in your army. There's certainly a lot of rules in the book for mercenaries, so it's obviously something they want to implement later. Monster handlers is mainly how to divide up wounds between the handler and the monster they're with, and just clarifies that sort of thing. It's a bit similar to how wounds used to be assigned to war machines. It's an unavoidable rule, and you're going to realize you need to look it up if you can't remember it. There's no real extra mental load. It's a very straightforward rule anyway. Monster Slayer makes you good at slaying monsters. It's basically the killing blow rule, but it only kicks in against enemies that have the monster special rule. Now, I have no idea what units could possibly get this monster slaying rule, but whoever it is, stay away from my demon prince, you ginger-bearded, nudist, freaky little men. Motley Crew is an important rule for some units. It basically allows you to have mixed weaponry and or mixed armor in a unit. And there are some units that historically did do that. I can think of Dark Elf City Guard. I can think of, I think there were some ogres that did that. It's one of those ones that kicks in during army building, so it should be fine. Two rules that are very similar, move and shoot, compared to move or shoot. They're both rules that have existed for decades. They're no different to what they've ever been. Basically, this rule does exactly what it says on the tin, except that's a lie. Move and shoot ought to be titled march and shoot. Now it makes sense. Move through cover lets you move through cover. But there's an extra bonus. It also lets you re-roll dangerous terrain tests, and in the versions I played, it didn't let you do that, and it's a nice little touch to make a rule actually slightly more beneficial. Multiple shots is just the old repeater rules that Dark Elves had on a few weapons. It can be multiple extra shots rather than just one extra shot. There's an X in brackets. It's just an easy rule. You're not going to forget about it. Multiple wounds X. So, for example, multiple wounds D3 is a rule that's been around for a long time. Again, just on bolt throwers and things like that. You can cause multiple wounds to your enemy when you hit them if you wound at all. Open order is simply a reference to a unit formation. It's one of the more basic unit formations, and it would previously have been only in the main rules. It can't go wrong. There's not any possible way to complain about it. Poisoned attacks has changed a little bit, whereas before it used to add +1 strength in the first round of combat. Certainly in the editions of the game that I know most, it does now instead mean that you wound automatically on hit rolls of a natural 6. I'm what many people I believe refer to as exploding 6 to hits. There's one small downside there that people will be familiar with. If you don't get to roll to wound, then you don't get to roll to see if your armor bane kicks in, if you have that as well. I looked briefly at a banner that gives you armor bane 2 and putting that with a unit that has poison attacks, and I realized, well, that's going to be counterproductive. Maybe an FAQ will fix that. I'm not sure it's an important problem, though. Ponderous just increases the penalty for moving and shooting, whilst Quick Shot eliminates the penalty for moving and shooting and removes the restriction on how far a charging unit has to be away for you to be able to stand and shoot against them. Rallying Cry is a way for characters to let nearby fleeing units use their leadership to rally instead. I find myself wondering if that would apply to Loner. It feels like it should from the way the rules are written, but not from how the rules are intended. I think it's one to keep an eye on as we go forward. Random attacks is exactly what you'd expect based on previous editions, but now if you have 10 models in a unit, each with their own random number of attacks, you roll 10 dice and add them all up to see how many attacks you get. A little bit of extra counting involved, but I think most people playing this game can count. Random movement, I'm going to have a bit of a whinge because I'm a physics teacher. Random movement is actually only random distance moved, not random direction, and movement has, like, you know, speed and direction and acceleration and all sorts of things. So it's not random movement, it's random distance. Actually, I think even better would be to call this random speed. The way I think they get away with it is that a character's speed characteristic is called its movement characteristic. Just bugs me because I have to teach this stuff to GCSE and A-level students, and I don't like it when it's already made more confusing for them. Regeneration is exactly what you'd expect. It gives you back wounds that you've suffered. Those wounds do still count for combat resolution, though. Regimental units we covered earlier briefly. It's a rule saying that detachment units can join them. Reserve move is a new one to this game for me, though I think it might have existed without me realising it in some editions. It allows units to move again at the end of the shooting phase. Now, in Ravening Hordes, this is strictly for Wolf Riders, Skeleton Archers, and Skeleton Chariots. Plus, there is an undead spell that allows any unit to do it. Now, this seems like a fantastic rule, but I know from previous experience of forgetting to move my Thalax after they shoot in the Horus Heresy that it will be forgotten sometimes. But it adds a new dimension to the game. It enhances some units in a very particular way. I think it's a fairly important one. Scouts is another name for what we'd call Infiltrate in another famous GW game. I don't want to mention it because it's 40k. It just lets you deploy outside of your deployment zone after everything else is deployed. Shield Wall allows units that are charged to give ground instead of falling back in good order. Could be really useful early game against the initial cavalry charges potentially. Skirmishers is simply a rule that says you can use a skirmish formation. Again, this wouldn't even have been a special rule in previous editions. No problem with it. Stomp attacks still happen at the end of combat. We call it Initiative 1, but they still happen at pretty much the same time. But they'll be simultaneous with great weapons and things like that. I think that's probably a good thing rather than a bad thing. And they hit automatically, which I think they always have done, so that's fine. Strike First gives you Initiative 10. Fairly obviously, Strike Last gives you Initiative 1. It doesn't make you go before Initiative 10 or after Initiative 1 now. I think that's probably a good thing for the rules rather than a bad thing. If you have both of those rules, by the way, they cancel out and you just operate at your normal initiative. These rules have existed before. They'll exist again. It all makes sense. I think it's actually been implemented better here than it has in previous versions. Now, Stubborn, I want to read this carefully, allows a unit to automatically pass its first break test of the game, which makes it a really important rule. It's going to help some units survive their initial charges that they have against them and fight back in subsequent rounds. That's going to be really important for a big block that's charged by a small number of cavalry, for example. They're likely to lose their rank bonus to rules like First Charge. They're going to take a lot of casualties to the higher initiative and higher strengths. But it means if they can just stick in the fight, their rank bonus will kick back in. They might get to make some attacks their own, etc., etc., and actually gives you a unit that you can put in the middle of your battle line and expect it to stick around for at least a little while. I'll pay for this rule anytime I get the option. I'll put it on my Bestigors. If I have Black Hooks, I'll put it on them. I think it's the main reason that chosen Chaos Warriors are better than regular Chaos Warriors, even compared to the extra attacks and extra leadership. Stupidity used to be a psychology rule, and now it's not quite as crippling as it used to be. A unit that fails its leadership test actually moves straight ahead rather than just standing still. But at least you don't find yourself falling so far behind you don't even get to take part in the rest of the battle. It doesn't, however, seem to explain what happens if you just march randomly forward into someone under the guise of stupidity. Now, Swift Stride is probably one of the most important of all the new rules, and it does a few different things. It increases a unit's maximum charge range by 3. For example, a unit with movement of 6 inches would normally be limited to charging units 12 inches away. But this rule would mean you could charge something 15 inches away, or at least within 15 inches. You'd have to be under 15 inches away, I suppose. It also adds d6 to the actual charge roll. So, for example, if you had a movement of 6, you'd then add the best out of 2 d6s, and another single d6 on top. You could actually roll up to 18 inches, although you're still limited to a maximum distance of 15 inches. But you are very likely to get that full 15-inch charge. It also helps you mow folks down if they flee you before you even reach them, because then I think you would be able to move the full 18, even though they were 15 inches away when you initially charged them, which seems like an extra benefit to reduce the impact of people who just put units of Chaos Hounds in front of them and flee every time you try and charge them. That person is me. I'm the person who does that with Chaos Hounds. I plan to keep doing so. It also, if you flee or if you pursue, adds d6 inches to your roll, which means you're better at both things. Honestly, I think it's a hugely important rule. It makes cavalry a much tougher proposition to avoid. It really enhances their role in the game in a way that I don't think was as big as it should have been in some editions previously. It means that ogres have a movement of 6 inches, but they're far worse at charging than Chaos Hounds, even though technically they're only 1 inch slower. A lot of units have this rule. You're going to need to make sure you know exactly how it works. I actually wish they'd broken it down in the rulebook with bullet points slightly better. I think they're going to get lots of questions about this. I think lots of people are going to play it wrong. But it's definitely important. And I do want to point out there is a definition of what a maximum possible charge range is in the charge section, which clearly says it's your movement plus 6 inches. Not your movement plus 6 inches plus d6 inches plus 3, which is, I think, what some people will try and get away with. Some people, I think, might try and deliberately misinterpret that. Others might just get muddled. I think it's important that people pay attention to this new one. Definitely extra mental load, but I think we'll get used to it quickly, and it adds a lot to the game. Terra does much of the same as we're used to. It crops up as a special rule and an example of psychology. You have to pass a leadership test if you want to charge something terrifying. It reduces defeated foes' leadership by 1 after combat and makes them more likely to run away, therefore. And it has the same interactions with fear that it always did. Basically, fearsome units only fear terrifying units. They aren't terrified by them and things like that. Timber seems to be a version of the Fallen Giant rule. Players now roll off to decide which way a model falls, and they cause d6 hits on the unit that they hit if they hit one at that model's strength and with AP -1. So if your unit just gets killed and then it falls over, you might still get to direct it straight at the unit it was fighting and get your own back. Or it might fall backwards onto one of your units that was waiting behind or fighting along with it, etc., etc. That's going to be funny. Unbreakable units automatically give ground. They never flee combat. Units and characters can only join unbreakable units if both the unit and the character have the unbreakable special rule, or if neither of them have the unbreakable special rule. Unstable is the old rule for undead that I think we've been used to for a lot of editions. Essentially, they never roll to see whether they flee, but you still work out combat resolution. And they start to crumble if they've lost combat, losing an extra wound for every point they lost the combat by. Vanguard's a nice rule. It lets a unit make a non-marching move before the first turn, and it's what we would call scouts in 40k. Veteran's a lovely little rule. It lets you re-roll a failed leadership test. Now, I think it's worth remembering here that whilst break tests use the leadership characteristic, they don't count as a leadership test. But this is a rule that will let you march close to enemy units that you might not otherwise get to do, because you can now do leadership tests to march even if you're within 8 of the enemy. I don't think that panic tests, fear tests, terror tests, and so on are leadership tests either. I think they're just tests that you do against the leadership characteristic. But from the way the rules read to me, I don't think this rule will affect fear, terror, panic tests. And I think if it did, it would be undercosted. It's one to look at carefully, though. Volley Fire is going to let you have more than one rank of archers fire. It lets half of the models in rear ranks shoot as well. It doesn't apply if the unit moved or if they're doing a standard shoot reaction. I hope nobody tries to be an arse and say, but I'm making a fire and flee reaction, so I can do it. Partly because fire and flee specifically calls out that doing a standard shoot is just part of a fire and flee reaction. So you wouldn't be able to do that part of the fire and flee reaction. You'd still count as doing a standard shoot. Don't be that person, please. Now, Warband is a rule that will be incredibly important for some armies, both in terms of how they build their armies and how opponents want to deal with those armies during the battle. I think you might land up wanting to whittle down many units simultaneously in armies that have this rule. Essentially, what it does is apply the unit's rank bonus to their leadership score, as well as to their combat results. I don't honestly remember if that was in editions after 5th, because I never really played them enough to become familiar. But it does mean that a unit of Gauls, for example, will probably be leadership 10 in the first turn of the game. But once they are down to 1 or 2 ranks in turn 5, they might be down as low as leadership of 6 or 7, depending on who's leading them, what else is happening. And they might run away very unexpectedly quite easily. They might fail a crucial attempt to march that's going to win you the game in some way, and so on and so forth. So whittling away at lots of units to give your opponent a chance to fail more of those leadership roles and let his army run away without you needing to do it yourself might be a good strategy against those armies. And as a general of those armies, you're going to want to think carefully to mitigate that problem and find ways to avoid it. The final rule here, I think, is a bit of an anticlimax. I mean, Warp Spawned sounds like it might be quite an impressive rule, but it seems to just be a rule we're familiar with from the old demon armies, that Warp Spawned units can't use regeneration against magical weapons, and Warp Spawned models can't be in the same unit as non-Warp Spawned models. Right, that was a lot of talking. I think it's clear, though, that that list of 75 special rules hasn't really made the game in any way more unwieldy than other editions. I think it's just that most things are now more easily organized alphabetically in one place and therefore easier to find. I actually think things are going to be easier rather than harder. And this is a step forward, not so much in terms of rules design, but in terms of rules presentation, which sometimes can be just as important. I mean, I've played a lot of 5th edition, and frankly, I think it's a great fun rule set. But there's some rules missing that don't exist at all that should exist, and it's hard to find even the ones that do sometimes. Now, I'm looking forward to playing this new Old World game. I still plan to play some 5th edition. I think I've gotten to a point with 5th edition where I know which rules are missing, so I don't bother looking for them anymore. With this, I feel like I'll be able to just look where I know the rule is going to be, and even if it then refers me on to another page number, I think that's actually really helpful. I don't have to go back and find where skirmishers is. I remember where the special rules bit is. I just flip to skirmishers and it sends me straight to that page number. It's going to be a lot easier. I mean, it's just like an extra bit of an index in some ways, I know, but it's nice and straightforward. And I hope that everyone agrees. There's, as I say, been a lot of negativity, mostly positivity, I have to say, but I just think it's worth trying to look for the good in things rather than looking for the bad. As always, I'll make my obligatory plug for Arbiter Ian's Tale of Four Gamers series, partly because I'm in it, but partly because, I think it's good and you should watch it. I'm sure anyway that, my appearances on that are probably a big part of how lots of you found this channel in the first place. But for those who found your own way to me, I recommend you do watch. We're going to be building armies for the Old World. I'm going to be doing Beastmen, and you'll see what the others are doing. We're going to be doing Legions Imperialis at the same time because of all the issues that game had on release. Or you could go back and watch us build our 5th edition armies from about 3 years ago. And we've done Horus Heresy armies, warbands for skirmish games, stuff like that. So take care. I'll either see you back here or I'll see you there. So bye-bye. Hey, bye-bye, bye-bye, bye.